Love talking to Anthony Herron. Love seeing your face in person, but here we are via Zoom, Pac-12 Perspective podcast. Anthony, it's draft week. We don't got spring games to cover. You don't have the draft to go to theoretically. Like, how are you operating amid these unique times in what is usually a really fun week for us?
Yeah, right, man. Because we've obviously still had the time to break down the film. You love it as much as I do. I know. One thing I've noticed the fact that the teams around the league aren't going to be there in person; they're operating virtually. So there's adjustments that they're having to make at the NFL level, just in preparation for not being in person and having some of those kind of last second debates that they're so accustomed to having. Somebody standing up on the table, they're going to be standing up on their own kitchen table or their office table while talking on a Skype or a Zoom with someone from their franchise, as opposed to just being able to just look across the table and yell in somebody's face. So the guys I'm talking to around the league are adjusting to that reality and preparing for it in that way. For me, in addition to breaking down the film, I would say it's at least in some ways it's made the conversations that I have with folks around the league, and that the availability of people around the NFL, it's enhanced a bit this year because guys aren't traveling around looking at prospects in person, flying guys into their facilities in the way that they normally would. So they're still conducting, a lot of the interviews with the same athletes they normally would, but there's just not as much travel time invested into either bringing that prospect in or them being on the road to do it. But it has, and you know the interpersonal interaction that goes into really evaluating not just if a prospect, when you're doing a one-on-one workout, if that suits your eye and your preferences, but the relationship end of it. Does this seem like a guy who's going to fit in your locker room, in your culture? Does he work in the environment that either you've already built with your franchise or that you're hoping to continue to establish moving forward? That end of it gets lost a bit. And that's one thing in the discussions I've had with some teams that really is noticed a lot in having to conduct everything right now digitally.
Right. Like everybody's talked about Justin Herbert, obviously. Just got an Instagram account like a week after the Rose Bowl, and like famously deleted all social media. I think his second year at Oregon. But we're talking about like Laviska Shenault, not afraid. Like I feel like he'll hit you back immediately with a DM or he'll comment with fans. Michael Pittman Jr. has a YouTube page, for crying out loud. That's incredible. Like, where do you look at personality among some of these prospects, and who do you think will get lifted up a little bit because of the personality that they've shaped around themselves versus what they could shape in a one-on-one interpersonal dinner with a GM and the front office and the staff?
I think, a guy that I think teams are going to, and probably have had an opportunity just in their digital interviews to start falling in love with a bit, is Michael Pittman Jr. I mean, when you think about the arc of his career trajectory, just early on, more of a special teams guy, obviously an NFL lineage that folks are going to respect around the league, because that ends up feeling important when you have a guy who's just been around professionalism, been around major athletics, grew up with a dad who played at that level. That carries weight. There's some gravitas with that. And I think that Michael Pittman, his size, his speed, the film from this past season is NFL caliber film. But then when you think about the fact that he wasn't sort of your standard blue chip USC receiver that came in and immediately was the dude, immediately was the guy being targeted at a high level in the passing attack on the outside, he made his bones on special teams. He made his bones being a guy willing to block in the screen game, and season over season worked at it, improved his skill, and all that immense effort finally played out in productivity. So the film is stellar with him from this past season, but also just the guy, the work ethic, the mentality that, he learned from his dad, Michael Pittman Sr. I think all those things, he's one that really jumps out into my head as someone that teams, while, is he a guy that's going to run routes for you in the slot? Not necessarily. When you evaluate what he brings to the table, it's a specific role, I would say, especially early in his career, that'll have to fit. But in evaluating his personality, the mentality that he'll have out on the football field, in the meeting room, on the practice field, I think he's a guy that teams are really very easily falling in love with as they think about whether or not he fits what they want, not just the tangible end, but the intangible.
One of my favorite things at practice is to stay late and find out who's staying late. And Deontay Burnett was always the last guy off the field. And then here came this other freshman. I was like, who is this guy? Yeah. And it was Michael Pittman Jr. And he always had that reputation. Somebody else who has that reputation are two corners. Every time I'm at UCLA, Darnay Holmes, last guy off the field. Right. And to me, first round corner. I get there's a lot of talent at that position this year, but Jalen Johnson, since he showed up on campus, his length, his demeanor, you watch him on tape, zero wasted movement, and he's been on an island basically since he got to Salt Lake City.
All right.
What do you think about those two and their personalities? You know, Darnay, he was, not afraid to speak his mind at the combine. He's got a personality. Jalen plays with an attitude that you can feel. Do you think their personas are going to get them elevated a little bit in this draft?
I think so. And, the film specifically for Jalen Johnson, I think, is so impressive as well. And like you referenced, it's a deep position in the draft this year. So there's potential he could get pushed out of the first round. If we get past night one and Jalen Johnson is a prospect that's still on the board, I think that's where we see a lot of activity between the end of day one and the start of day two, because he is a first round talent. He's that caliber of playmaker. And the fact that Utah was willing and able to travel him around the field. When I've evaluated the corner position this season, there's really only a couple of guys. I mean, the guy at the top of the draft board, I have Jeff Okudah, not just as the number one corner. I think he's the number one player in the draft this year. I just think his film is that stellar from this past season. And they just had so much NFL talent in that Ohio State secondary that he really wasn't a true starter until this season. But I just think there's, not zero holes, but there's very few holes. There's virtually zero holes in his game. But Jeff Okudah and Jalen Johnson are really two of the guys who truly traveled, outside left, outside right, slot left, slot right. They were willing and able to play these individuals in a variety of slots. And Kyle Whittingham I'm sure he talked to you about it a lot. He talked to me about it a lot. What a joy that was. What a tool that was to have Jalen Johnson and his ability to do that. And I think for Darnay Holmes, I mean, he's a guy been paying close attention to him since high school, like you referenced with the whole All-American Bowl process. I think Darnay's productivity on the field has ebbed and flowed a little bit. He is a guy who bigger receivers have been able to create some separation against at times. UCLA, depending on the scheme, which he's been in multiple schemes defensively throughout his magnificent career there. But there's been times where he's left on an island without a pass rush, and folks have been willing to throw at him on occasion. When you look at just the physical traits, like he went to the Senior Bowl and balled out. When you watch him just in drills, you see the movement skills that are there, and you reference the work ethic. I mean, in the classroom, on the practice field, and then on game day, everything ties him into being a guy who folks are going to continue to fall in love with between now and when they're actually selecting. He certainly, he's not going to be a first-round pick because of depth at that position, but a lot of folks are seeing him right there operating in the middle of the field and seeing his abilities as a nickel. And I think that's where he can definitely carve out a niche for himself very early in his NFL career.